Hello, Noam. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, May 10th, 2021. It's wonderful to have you back. And I just wanted to follow up on a bit of our interview from last year in May. We had May Day 2020, and it was a great talk. And I just wanted to kind of discuss a little bit of what's happened since and a little bit of follow up on some of the topics we've talked about.
Okay.
Perfect. Just as an introduction, though, you have been on interview streak. The pandemic hasn't slowed you down at all.
No, on the contrary, more just a flood of interview requests.
Exactly, exactly. I want to ask you just quickly, before we segue into the next question, how has the technology kind of changed your experience? Do you like the ability to do a lot more interviews, or do you find it anything missing from it? How's your Zoom experience been during the pandemic?
Well, I'm glad to do it. I'm delighted that people are interested in discussing these issues. They're of great significance. Of course, it cuts into time that I'd like to use on a lot of work that I'm involved in, which is pretty exciting and interesting. I don't have enough time for.
Yeah, I can imagine what your calendar looks like. I'd be terrified to see it. The reason I ask about the technology is because in our last interview, I brought up the work of David F. Noble.
Great.
Yeah,
He's
and
fine. A good friend.
yeah, he was a good friend, and I've been, kind of doing a bit of a dive into his work. He has some local relevance here in Vancouver. He was supposed to work here, and he got kind of a lot of people say kind of shut out unfairly because of the nature of his work. And
Well, there's good reason to believe that that book, which was a major contribution, contributed to his denial of tenure at MIT. It's contested, but I followed it closely. He was a good friend, and I think there's some credibility to the story. He discovered some very interesting things. They're highly relevant. So I don't know if you want to talk about them, but
yes,
okay.
please.
Well, one of the main things he studied was the machine tool industry. This is mainly in the 1950s. Machine tool industry is basically the foundation of the whole productive system. And at the time in the 1950s, things were shifting generally from old-fashioned computational systems, punch cards, so on, to modern computers. And one of the things that was going on was development of what was called numerical processing, computer-run methods to facilitate greater efficiency in the machine tool industry. And there were basically, as David pointed out, two ways you could move to establish this technology. One way was to train skilled mechanics in the new technology and have them develop with their own capacities and knowledge to develop techniques for running all of this and take control of the process. That was one way. The other way was to de-skill mechanics, turn them into robots, and let the automation take over. Now, what David showed was that there was no economic advantage to the second approach. First approach worked very well, but it was the second approach that was chosen for, he argues, I think plausibly, essentially for class reasons. The effort to ensure management control and de-skilling and subordination of the workforce overwhelmed questions of efficiency and productivity, which is a pretty interesting discovery. The thing that harmed his tenure proposal was that he provided some, wasn't his main topic, but in the course of the work, he showed that the MIT Mechanical Engineering Department had essentially misappropriated work that had been done elsewhere. They weren't very happy about that, and that, I think that probably played a role in the controversy that followed about his tenure. He went off to Canada, to York University.
Yeah, he was a very kind of courageous figure to speak up about that in a lot of ways. He, one of his topics, just to I'll jump a bit forward, was in his later part of his career was kind of the corporatization of Canadian universities and the kind of, you actually mentioned, yeah, you mentioned this recently actually in passing in a podcast with the New York Times with Ezra Klein about the kind of, you know, there's been a kind of cheapening effect in higher education. There's been a lot of, you know, formerly tenured staff being replaced with kind of precarious, you know, temporary staff. And he kind of fought against that a lot.
It's a long process that started in pretty much in the 1970s and took off in the 1980s. It's part of the whole neoliberal effort to shift power over to the hands of the business classes. And part of it was imposing business models in universities. It's happening in much of the world. In Britain, one of the major critical intellectuals, Stefan Collini, who writes about educational matters, described the Tory programs for Oxford and Cambridge as, in his words, programs of turning first-class universities into third-class commercial enterprises. So you want to have a classics department, show that you can sell it on the market. You know? And destroys the whole basis for the universities set up in the 18th century.
So there's a, yeah, and that's one of the funny things about our last interview was I kind of chastised myself for asking such big questions, but as always, when I hear you talk, it connects to 10 other different things that I want to ask. But just to carry on with what you said, that a classics department is perceived as a, you know, it needs to be a business. It's perceived as a public expense rather than something that benefits society. I feel like that narrative, which is kind of on the edge of that neoliberal assault, is really, really damaging and really, really prevalent. But on the other hand, currently in Canada, we have huge amounts of public subsidies going towards oil pipelines. Here in the west coast of Canada, there's a huge pipeline that in the midst of the climate crisis, the government actually purchased outright from the company in order to push through Vancouver. You know, just carrying on your one of your books, The Climate Crisis and the Green New Deal, I kind of want to explore that topic, which is how in our kind of public discussions and in society, huge amounts of, you know, corporate damaging subsidy is not regarded as a huge expense, but things that benefit society as a whole, like, you know, education and funding for classics and culture is not. Could you speak about that a little bit?
It's a reflection of the principle that actually Adam Smith described very well back in 250 years ago. He described what he called the masters of mankind. In his day, that was the merchants and manufacturers of England. And he said, the masters of mankind are the principal architects of government policy, and they make sure that their own interests are very carefully attended to, however grievous the effect on others including the people of England, and of course the victims of what he called the savage injustice of the Europeans, English, British in India and elsewhere. So that was 250 years ago. Things have changed, but some things remain the same.
Yes, sadly. That is a very kind of, yeah, potent kind of observation, and one that I think kind of leads to the next question of, what do we do about that? You've been very vocal in your support for the Sunrise Movement, who are doing wonderful things. There are other groups like Extinction Rebellion. One thing about you, Noam, is that you are, by the way, this will be posted on Chomsky, which is a group of readers of your work who are enthusiastic about it, so very familiar. But even though, you have a lot of kind of practical mindset towards practical solutions to these problems, you've always kind of represented, at least to a couple of us, the kind of distinction between the liberal mainstream and the left. And what I want to ask is, in your new book with Marv Waterstone, I'm doing a bit of a library thing here for you, Consequences of Capitalism.
But everything.
Yeah, I do. I have a little bookshelf I thought I'd whip out. But one of the words you use a lot in this, it's a core tenet of the book, is coalitional politics. And what that relates to is to me, has always been, even if there is a kind of distinction between, liberals, pro-market liberals and say leftists, you need to practically think about tactics, cooperation, and working with everybody to bring about the kinds of changes to solve these issues. Can you speak a little bit about coalitional politics and the kind of...
Let's take the matter that you just raised, actually only the most important one in human history, so it's fair to talk about that. What do we do about destruction of the climate? So it's a perfect example of coalition politics. The press, as far as I know, didn't report it, maybe in Canada, but about a week ago, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ed Markey, who's a senior senator in Massachusetts, involved in environmental issues all his life. The two of them instituted a legislative proposal in Congress, actually reinstituted. They had done it before and it had died, but this time they placed a detailed, careful legislative proposal to Congress, which actually on what to do about destruction of the environment, went to all the nuts and bolts, very carefully done. It's in fact not very different from what Bob Holland's work, which is developed and reviewed in our book, and other work of others, including international agencies. Jeff Sachs, an economist at the Columbia Earth Institute, has come out with similar proposals. And the Ocasio-Cortez Markey legislation fits very well within that framework. So here's an answer. How did it get that far? Well, a lot of it was due to groups like Sunrise Movement. They occupied congressional offices, Nancy Pelosi's office, Speaker of the House, demanding that something should be done. Extinction Rebellion, global climate strike had laid the basis for a lot of concern about this, a lot of mass mobilization. Ordinarily, they would have just been kicked out by the Capitol Police. This time they weren't. Ocasio-Cortez joined them, became an issue. She came in on the Sanders wave. Sanders did create enormous openings for new things to happen, also on the basis of a lot of activism. All of this stuff interrelates in many ways. So there's coalition politics, left activism of a very militant and appropriate kind, legislation that could answer the problem. Now there's a barrier. I mentioned that the press didn't cover it. Well, that's pretty significant. They know perfectly well that it's either this proposal or cataclysm. It's not a small question. Talk to a journalist at the New York Times or an editor, they'll sort of agree to that, but you don't cover it. And the reason they don't cover it is because of something called objectivity, which you learn in journalism school. Objectivity, I don't know if you ever suffered through journalism school, but if you did, you'd have learned that objectivity means reporting accurately what's happening in the centers of power. In the United States, the phrase is within the Beltway. The Beltway is the area of Washington where everything important happens, Congress, executive branch, and so on. So you report that accurately. And if you report anything else, it's bias. It's your personal bias. It should be in an opinion column, not in the news. The news is what's happening at the centers of power. Well, now we go back to Adam Smith. Centers of power are actually the corporate headquarters. That became, it's always true to some extent, it became exaggerated during the neoliberal period, which was designed explicitly to make that true. Go back to Reagan's inaugural address. The main line that's quoted all the time is, government is the problem, not the solution. Translate that into English, it means corporate headquarters are the solution. Because decisions don't stop being made when government doesn't make them. It just goes to other centers of power, namely the masters of mankind. That was coincided with the pronouncements of the economic guru of the neoliberal wave, Milton Friedman, that corporations have only one responsibility: greed, maximizing profit, shareholder value. If you incorporate, you can do it as an individual or a group. That's a gift from the public. You're getting lots of advantages from incorporation that the public offers you. But according to the Reagan-Friedman doctrine, you have no responsibilities. You just take the gift and run with it. And run means massive robbery of the population. We actually have some estimates of that now. I may have mentioned it last, no, it could have been too early, but a couple of months ago, the Rand Corporation, super respectable corporation, tried to do an estimate of the robbery of the public by the super rich during this period. They used much more anodyne words. They didn't call it robbery, that's my word. They talked about the transfer of wealth from the lower 90% of the population to the very top. It's actually a fraction of 1% mostly, during the 40 neoliberal years since Reagan. Almost $50 trillion, which is a serious underestimate because it doesn't include all the other devices that Reagan and the people around him offered to the super rich, like tax havens, for example, which were illegal before and supervised, controlled by the Treasury Department, but under what are called libertarian principles, which means radically anti-libertarian. Under those principles, it's all corporations, tyrannical concentrations of economic power can do whatever they like. So if Apple Corporation wants to avoid taxes by setting up an office in Ireland, that's fine. Well, nobody knows the exact numbers, but it's because it's secret. But general estimates, including the IMF, are tens of trillions of dollars. So we're maybe talking about 70 or 80 trillions of dollars of robbery of the working class and the middle class. Perfectly legal robbery, you know, in fact, authorized by the government, made legal by the neoliberal programs. There's another part of those programs which is not emphasized enough. Both Reagan and Thatcher, or the people who are doing their thinking for them, realized right away something pretty straightforward. If you're going to carry out a massive assault against the working class, you better remove any means of defense. There's one means of defense, unions. So their first actions, first ones, both here and in England, was to destroy the labor movement. Big attack on the major unions, which opened the door for corporations to use numerous previously illegal means opened by the government to break strikes, to prevent union action and so on. And in fact, it's worked. Union movement has sharply declined. Now there's a very close correlation between unionization and inequality. The more unionization goes down, more inequality goes up. Mechanisms are pretty obvious, don't have to describe them. And that's exactly what we've seen. All of this was laid out very clearly in the early 1980s, just the way I described it. Economists didn't care. They have an abstract model that says that in some ideal universe, markets work, so I can prove theorems about it, so who cares? This was done all over the world, and you see the effects. Take India. India right now is a real catastrophe, health catastrophe. Why? In the 1990s, the neoliberal wave hit India. So they moved to neoliberal policies. One of them is to destroy the healthcare system, to privatize it, which means destroy it. If you have a public healthcare system, it takes care of people. You have a private healthcare system, it's like the United States. The idea is to make profit, not to treat people. So costs are twice as high as comparable countries and worse outcomes. Well, the United States is a very rich country. It can survive this tremendous attack. Not well, but can survive it. Not India. As soon as the crisis came, India is devastated. They essentially destroyed the public health system. Expenses on public health in India are probably maybe 1% of GDP or something like that. And of course, if you really look at the details, you can see how really rotten this system is. So one of the problems in the United States and India and so on is there just aren't any beds. Why aren't there any beds? Because there's a business model that says you should have what's called on-time delivery, no excess capacity. So if you're running an assembly line in an auto plant, you have to make sure that you don't waste any resources by, let's say, having a spare assembly plant in case something goes wrong. Okay, that's okay for making an automobile. So if the assembly line breaks down, you wait a while, you fix it, not a catastrophe. If you don't have beds, it's a catastrophe. So when everything is done, it's called lean and mean, super efficient, top profitability, you get a disaster. You can see it very clearly by comparing countries. So Germany was a leader in neoliberalism, but they call it ordoliberalism, but they didn't go this far. So the hospitals did have extra capacity, extra beds, extra diagnostic capacity, and so on. So when the pandemic hit, they were able to react. If you have a country that says, no, we got to be at the limit to maximize profit, well, you get the United States where it was bad enough, you get India where it's just cataclysm. So yes, these are highly destructive systems. They've been very valuable in concentrating wealth and power. So during these 40 years in the United States, 0.1% of the population, not 1%, 0.1% has seen their wealth double from 10% of total wealth to spectacular 20% of total wealth. So it's been very successful. Corporate profits are boom, very rich are doing great. Tax system has been modified so that by now, for the first time in a century in the United States, billionaires pay a lower rate of taxes than working people. Trump helped this with his tax scam, is one major legislative achievement. It's kind of interesting that this goes on while the people who are at the peak of destroying the working class, like Trump, Pauly, the rest of them, are waving slogans saying, we're the working class party. That's a pretty tricky, pretty significant achievement. Takes a very cultivated demagogue to carry that off.
You've touched on my next question, which is exactly that. It's how so much of what you've described is so intensely felt by working people all across the world, actually, and not just North America. How has the kind of political faction that's empowering all of this basically evil, how have they like rhetorically managed to say that we are the working class? Trump has made criticism of Amazon, a huge part of his, campaign, but he was enabling it. The tax cuts, the reduction of regulations meant to protect people, it's robbery, and it's being repackaged and sold back to people. And so it's kind of, from a propaganda standpoint, it's borderline impressive.
It's impressive. Reasons are, it actually goes back to Richard Nixon. Nixon was actually the last liberal president. You look at his legislative programs, more liberal than anything that followed. Maybe Biden will reverse that. But he also understood that the Republicans can't possibly win elections on their own policies. The Republicans, United States is basically a one-party state, business party, but it does have two factions. And the Republicans have been the ones more dedicated to the welfare of the masters of mankind. Democrats had, from the New Deal, some residual commitment to working people, the poor. Well, Nixon understood you can't go to the public and say, I'm in favor of giving everything to the super rich and the corporations and shafting you, so please vote for me. Can't do that. So you have to turn to what are now called cultural issues. Now, Nixon got a boost from the fact that Democrats had voted for the mild civil rights legislation. And Nixon realized that by putting themselves forward as the party of white supremacy and racism, the Republicans could pick up Southern Democrats. So the Democratic votes shifted in the South. That's the Southern strategy, it was called. It's perfectly open. I mean, they didn't say, I'm a racist, but there are lots of ways of indicating it without saying the words, and they did. So they picked up the Southern votes. Reagan, who actually was a racist, deep committed racist, he did it all the time. His little funny stories about welfare queens, by implication, black, coming to the Social Security office in their limousines to steal your checks and so on. I mean, he was a genius at that because it was second nature for him. He was a racist anyway. Actually, he was the last political figure to support apartheid in South Africa. Even when the whole system was collapsing, continued to support it. But so it was easy for him. But the same was true on other issues. The Republicans picked up their anti-abortion stand when their strategists realized that if they could pretend to be anti-abortion, they would pick up the evangelical vote. It's 25% of the population, a lot of the Northern Catholic vote. So they all switched on a dime. None of them had been opposed to abortion before.
Mm-hmm.
They were mostly pro-choice. But George H.W. Bush, Reagan, the rest of them just totally switched. Now that's a mantra of the Republican Party. Same on guns. Climate denial is a little different. They were threatened by the Koch brothers energy corporation that unless they took a strict position of denial of climate change, they'd lose their funding and they'd run candidates against them and so on. So they all switched. So now you have a party that tries to get votes on what's called cultural issues. Mm-hmm. If you look closely at the January 6th rioters, a large part of what motivated them is these ideas of what's called the Great Replacement. Trump, again, is a genius at stirring this up. The Democrats are fostering massive immigration across the southern border so that they can replace the white race and maybe carry out genocide against the white race. I live in Tucson. You can go to gated communities right near Tucson where rich people come for retirement, living in more security than you can possibly imagine. But there, people like Steve Bannon go to raise money, private money, to build a wall because they're threatened by these hordes coming across the border. I mean, you can't use the word paranoia. It's not strong enough.
Yeah.
And then you get people, but it's real. People believe it. And that's why 70% of Republicans think that Trump won the election. It's like worshiping in a cult. And you can understand why they think it. That's what they hear from their leaders. That's what they hear from the echo chamber, Fox News, to which they turn for information. So why not believe it? That's why virtually no Republicans think that the climate problem is serious. Actually, 14% when you rank in polls, you rank issues with urgency. That's considered the lowest issue. The highest issue is illegal immigration, the most urgent issue. And of course, the federal deficit, which became an issue on November 4th, when Democrats are responsible for it. Before that, Reagan taught us that deficits don't matter. That's true up to November 4th, but now we switch. So deficits are the highest problem, and which is code words for saying don't do anything that'll help improve the situation of poor and working people. So that's the highest priority, along with illegal immigration. And the lowest is destruction of the environment. I mean, this is a real achievement.
This is, yeah, it really is. I have about, you've touched on about 10 of my questions, and it's, but one of the ones that I want to go back to was mentioning how factionalized America is currently, and how there's basically two factions of the same party. It's a recipe for disaster. I actually emailed you a little while ago about some of the struggles in Canada. There's been a fair amount of talk over first past the post voting, but in the national conversation of the United States, it rarely comes up, and it's even more severe, the problem. Trump lost by 2 million votes. George Bush also lost the popular vote. And when you get to the Senate and congressional levels, it's even worse. The democratic deficit phrase that I learned from you is crazy. And so, can you speak a little bit about the electoral system, the kind of gap between actual democracy and what we call democracy, based on putting your name on a piece of paper, and the history of it, if you can?
I mean, in the 18th century, the American Constitution was a leap forward in the 18th century. Even a phrase like "we the people," even if it wasn't implemented, just articulating it sent shivers down the spines of European leaders. In fact, if you look at the great leaders of Europe, Metternich, the Tsar, King George III, they were terrified by what they called the rise of republicanism in the colonies, which poses a severe threat to the civilized order, to what we now call the liberal international order. They called it the civilized order. Civilization's going to be destroyed by these raving maniacs who are trying to bring the whole rabble into dealing somehow with affairs of state. George III, one of his concerns at the American Revolution is it would erode the British Empire by what's now called the domino theory. Others would follow, and the whole thing would collapse. Very common concerns. We're familiar with them now. Happen to be the American Revolution, which was the threat then. Well, of course, take a look at the Constitution. It's a conservative doctrine. In fact, the major scholarly study, gold standard scholarship, Michael Klarman's book is called The Framers Coup, a coup against democracy, which it was. The public, the backwoodsmen, the guys working in the fields, they wanted democracy, but they're not the ones who could get to Philadelphia. This is the 18th century. Not a lot of people could spend 3 months in Philadelphia or even get there. So what you had, the founders were rich, conservative, slave owners almost entirely, and they didn't want democracy. So they set up many ways to prevent democracy. Nevertheless, by 18th century standards, it was a step forward. But we're not in the 18th century. Things have happened since then. The idea that we are, the dominant idea in legal circles is called, especially among conservatives, is called originalism. A very interesting doctrine. We have to think what the words meant, or textualism it's sometimes called. To interpret the laws, you have to say, what did the words mean in the 18th century? I mean, species of insanity. It's pure insanity. Who cares what the words meant in the 18th century? But that's a very good way to prevent progress and to ensure that the masters stay in charge. So that's the doctrine. And if the United States today were, say, to try to join the European Union, it would be turned down by the European Court of Justice. They'd never tolerate a system like this. Take a look at the Senate, which was established by Madison as to be the main decision-making component of government. The executive in those days was more or less an administrator, not what it is now. So the Senate was the center of power. That's why it has 6-year terms. Not, in fact, it wasn't even elected until the progressive movements of the 20th century, 1913. It was picked by the elite for 6 years. In Madison's words, it was to be the wealth of the nation, the more responsible group of men who recognize the rights of property owners. And in fact, Madison's view was that a main goal of government was, quoting, protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. Okay, that's the Constitution. And there are all kind of devices to lead to that result. There've of course been plenty of popular struggles since, and they've been eroded, but still very largely enforced. So it's a conservative document, and you can see the effects. So the Senate, say the state of Wyoming has about 500,000 people, 2 senators. The state of California has 47 million people, 2 senators. Well, no modern democracy would tolerate that. Mm-hmm. And same with the Electoral College and many other things. But that's not enough for the Republicans. They have a built-in structural majority, but it's not enough. In the series of lies for which he's famous, Trump did manage to sneak in a couple of true sentences. One of them was that Republicans can never win a free election. That's actually true. So therefore, you can see what's happening right now. Every Republican-run state is instituting very stringent measures to try to block voting for people who are going to vote Democratic. Minorities, the poor, how to keep them from voting. I think there are a couple hundred legislative proposals being rammed through now. If they want to come back in 2022, as they might, they have to prevent voting, despite all the advantages they already have. If you look at the last elections over the last couple of decades, the Democrats almost always win the popular vote, but they lose the elections.
So one thing I want to, I'm going back to my library here. One of the things that you mentioned was, how we, the people, was kind of a terrifying thing to the ruling classes back then. There's a book you recommended, Intellectual History of the Working Classes by Jonathan Rose.
It's a wonderful book.
Wonderful book.
Very, very timely.
Super. Super timely.
This is around a 800-page book, a big, thick book, scholarly book, in which he shows that this is about England, ordinary working people in England in the 19th century were better educated than aristocrats. And that was true in the United States too. Like if you were, say, an Irish blacksmith in Boston, maybe illiterate, nevertheless, if you could manage it, you'd hire a 14-year-old kid to read classics to you, and they knew them. It was very interesting if you look at the uneducated working classes in the 19th century in the United States. First of all, they were very radical by contemporary standards, off the spectrum. Mm-hmm. But they and the farmers as well believed in what they called a cooperative commonwealth with no bosses. We run things ourselves. We run the factories, we run the farming banks, farming distributions, all should be popular. Yeah. Real radical revolution. And they thought about it. There were barely literate itinerant workmen who were writing very serious essays using the labor theory of value that was developed by Adam Smith and David Ricardo. They didn't know any Marx. Just to lead to the conclusion that anyone who appropriates the labor of anyone else is robbing them. So if you work for a boss and he takes a proportion of the value of the labor that you produced, that's robbery. He has no right to that. It's your labor, you have total right to it. And they worked this out from the main theories of value developed by the major economists of the day. Very thoughtful, careful work. That's like what Jonathan Rose found. This lasted into the 1930s. I mean, I remembered as a kid, my extent, my family was first generation immigrants. My father, for example, studied in what's kind of like a Quranic madrasa. Kids learned nothing but the Talmud, study the Talmud all day. You weren't allowed to mention America because it wasn't in the Bible, you know. That's where he grew up until he was 17 years old. But they got here and they educated themselves. In fact, he ended up with a PhD. Other members of the family who were in the 30s, unemployed working people, were very educated. And they listened to their discussions. I'm a 7-year-old kid. It's all about the latest Shakespeare plays, and the New Deal was allowing Shakespeare plays in the park. The latest concert of the Budapest String Quartet. What do you think about that? The difference between Freud and Steckel, you know, that's what people are talking about. Some of them barely went to school. A lot of this is coming out of the labor movement, which had labor education programs. Well-known scientists were showing up at mathematicians in labor education programs, mostly communists, but this was all just part of the world. I mean, that's been beaten out of people's heads. It's part of more general imposition of illiteracy, but a lot of reasons for it. But what Jonathan Rose wrote about, I think, is perfectly feasible. That's uneducated working people in England.
So you've actually touched on my next question and my follow-up. One of the really striking things to me about the work was how the upper classes were very parochial and very intent on maintaining the status of education to be something for them, not for the working classes.
Right.
There's from the church to the government, all throughout. And today, so my question is that today we have huge corporations ruling social media companies, and we have ruling social media networks, and we have lots of misinformation going around, and rightfully so. There's a huge amount of concern about this, and from a left perspective, along the lines of David Noble, I think the concern is really valid and to talk about. But on the other hand, I think in mainstream liberal circles, there has also been a kind of the same sort of attitude that Rose documents of parochial kind of imposition of an understanding of like what's proper to know. This is what you should know. This is how you should know it. And there's been a kind of reaction against the misinformation stuff towards making working people more kind of an effort to make them fall in line more with traditional liberal mainstream establishment values. Sorry for the wordiness of that, but your work, especially in the 80s and 90s, focused on something called intellectual self-defense. And it's something that I actually named my channel after. So it's something I kind of wanted to talk about with you. Like, what are the possibilities for, self-education in this environment, and what sort of impediments and what sort of impediments to it are there, and what do you see in our kind of intellectual climate and public discourse that is different from what Rose described?
Well, you raise a lot of important issues. We should mention some of them. The liberal Democrats under Obama instituted or expanded, they didn't institute them, programs in the schools which are highly destructive of serious education. They imposed teaching to test, basically. A lot of tests, study for the test, and it's got to be monitored, get a lot of data from it, and so on and so forth. And that's the way education should be. Absolutely the worst possible kind of educational system. This was during the Enlightenment, 18th century. This was ridiculed. It was called a form of education, which is like pouring a liquid into a vessel, and then the vessel pours out the liquid. So they made fun of it as ludicrous. That's Obama and his educational program, teaching to test. We've all had experiences of you take a course, you hated it, have to pass the exam, so you study in the last week and you get an A in the exam. 2 weeks later, you forgot what the course was about. That's teaching to test. If you want intellectual self-defense, that means teaching people how to think for themselves, not pass a test. I don't care if you pass a test or not. I mean, in a serious scientific university like MIT, nobody cares about test scores. You don't care about grades. You care about what you learn, Are you able to think for yourself? One of the famous comments by a great physicist taught at MIT is, he taught his classes, is, doesn't matter what we cover, it matters what you discover. You discover a couple of things, doesn't matter. The rest you can pick up in a book, once you've understood what's important. One Nobel laureate at MIT, who was a personal friend, used to teach his graduate courses by saying, just giving a lecture, not preparing, says, here's the way I think it ought to turn out. Whatever the content is for that day, it ought to look like this. I didn't have time to look it up. Your task is to show that I'm wrong or find what's right, That's the way, and you can do that down to kindergarten. I mean, it is done. So you can have teaching systems that do cultivate curiosity. You don't even have to cultivate curiosity with children because they automatically have it. What you have to do is beat it out of their heads. I mean, little kids are driving you crazy asking why all the time. They want to understand the world. You go to school and knock it out of your heads. Just learn this, pass a test, and come back. But you can support the natural curiosity, cultivate it, get people to think for themselves, to challenge. If something's taken for granted, you should immediately say something's wrong. If it's taken for granted, why does everybody agree? It's probably a scam. Let's look into it and see. That kind of attitude can be cultivated right away. And you develop your own intellectual self-defense. That's the way it develops. It's like developing antibodies. It comes from reacting to the pathogens out there. And I think, but the liberal Democrats wanted the opposite. What they wanted is Marine Corps training. You study for a test, you pass the test, get the data, hand it over to the Bill Gates Foundation. They do some studies of it, and so on and so forth. And that goes along with defunding. During the neoliberal period, just like hospitals, there's been radical defunding of the educational system. I mean, I'm now teaching at Arizona State University, so you can see it the way I didn't see it at MIT. State legislature, which is Republican, they're the ones who are carrying out the recount of the ballots. They don't see any reason why there should be university altogether. Why teach all this stuff about medieval history and all that nonsense? You don't make any money out of that. So if there should be a university, it should be vocational training to go into business. So the university is radically defunded, and they make out in many ways, but it's a battle. Defunding for state universities has dropped radically during the neoliberal years, and for public education as well. Part of the purpose is to kill public education. You go back a century, mass public education was a major contribution of the United States. The United States pioneered in mass public education, a major reason for US progress through the 20th century. But now they want to kill it because it's for the general public, and who cares about them? What we want is elite schools for the rich, where they can learn how to be corporate managers and so on, financial advisors and things that matter.
I want to ask you something. Sometimes I feel bad for you because the breadth of questions you're asked is more than most people, which you are always up to the challenge for. But my next one I think it's an anthropological question. And I do want to be respectful of your time here, so I'll try and be quick. But did you, first of all, did you actually have any association or any comments on the passing of David Graeber in the past year, public intellectual? Did you know him?
I didn't know him personally, but I knew his work very well. Very important figure. Did wonderful work.
Did wonderful work. Yeah, he was a leader in the Occupy movement, and he was constantly talking about. He was an anthropologist,
but also he was one of the big supporters of the Kurdish Rojava movement. His scholarly work broke open a lot of areas of the richness and achievements of what's called prehistoric societies, meaning they showed a lot of cultural wealth, richness. He was an anarchist. He gave strong arguments to show that the imposition of the state system undermined lots of achievements that made. Very valuable work.
Very valuable work, yeah. And that was one thing to touch on is, he talked a lot about kind of how our notions of, efficiency and, public good and private good are pretty twisted.
He wrote a great book on bullshit jobs.
Yeah.
How most of the work that's being done is just kind of shuffling papers to keep something happening. To throw out, and there could be really productive work that people need. So that's worth thinking about when you think about the alleged threat of automation. I mean, there's an awful lot of work that's done just in managing systems that isn't really necessary at all. I mean, you can see it in the United States. One place where you see it dramatically is if you go into a hospital. Before you can, you go into the emergency room, which I've had to do a number of times, and before you can even be looked at, you have to fill a lot of paperwork out. Is the insurance company going to pay for it? Is there something in the small print you didn't notice? So you have to show I can pay for it myself, and on and on. And if you walk through the wards of the best hospitals in the country, Mass General, you go through the cancer ward. There's at the center of the floor, there's about a bunch of desks where about 20 people are working on administration.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, in Canada, you don't have, in fact, there was a study by Harvard Medical School comparing the best hospital in the United States, Mass General, with the best hospital in Toronto, and just comparing it in many respects. And one of the questions they looked at when they went to the Toronto hospital is they asked, where's the billing department? Kind of blank stare. And finally, somebody said, oh yeah, there's an office down in the basement for Americans who come here. We have to have a billing department. In the United States, that's half the hospital.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's one of the most valuable things of his work. I just want to ask just a quick question here, Noam. I want to be really respectful of your time. Are you okay to stretch a little bit over the hour? Is that?
Well, unfortunately, I have a medical appointment which I can't delay. I'll have to end at the hour.
Okay, for sure. Would it be okay to just have a couple quick questions, just to for some burning questions on our Chomsky? I just wanted to quickly say, like, we are a subreddit. We're a community who are really enthusiastic about your work. Our number one work to introduce people to your writings is this one, The Indispensable Chomsky, Understanding Power. I hope you enjoy the library I compiled here.
I've heard from a lot of people that that's the most accessible book. That was just informal discussion.
Yeah.
A couple of days informal discussion, incidentally, with the editors, who are two public interest lawyers, did a magnificent work of job of
Document.
putting in footnotes. It's on the internet, but it's a remarkable resource.
Yeah, my actual question for you was, you have such a long history. What's your own personal work that you think you're very kind of proud of, or you feel either the direct consequence of was great, or you feel you would recommend to someone? I like Failed States. You know, it's up to you.
In the eye of the beholder.
Yeah, the beholder. All right.
When I look back at anything, all I can think of is two things. One is how much I've forgotten, and two is look at all these things that should have been done better.
Well, it's a you know, we're all highly highly enthusiastic about your work. I just have one other kind of related question is, you know, you see, you know, for me, you were one of the first real intellectual awakenings of, and for many other young people, you're a real force of intellectual awakening for us. And now you see people like Nathan J. Robinson, who's on the Journal of Current Affairs. You were recently, for one of rare occasions, on mainstream media on MSNBC. I believe that's because Mehdi Hassan loves your work. When you look at the generation of young people who you know, have loved your work and taken influence from you, and have tried, you know, who are like on the left but tried to be anti-ideological in the way that you've always been consistent of and professed in your career, how does that make you feel?
There are plenty of people. I don't like to mention names because I'll inevitably leave some out, and that's wrong. But there's a lot of great young people.
And last question for you, because I want to be respectful of your time. Ironically, that's what the question is about. I am not MSNBC. I am not the New York Times. I am a very small channel reporting kind of for like a.
I'm not on MSNBC. In fact, I had my first 10 minutes on MSNBC ever about a month ago.
Yeah.
They had a new appointment, Mehdi Hassan, who's a pretty good guy. And he was able to sneak me in. But that was my first appearance on MSNBC, New York Times.
I enjoyed it thoroughly. So my question to you is, you know, I often feel bad that, you know, I email you, we touched on this in the beginning of the interview. You know, you have thousands of emails, but, you know, you've always been so generous with your time and so respectful of people's inquiries and addressing people where they're at. You know, especially for someone of your, I know it doesn't mean much to you, but your intellectual stature, where does it, you know, where does it come from? And can you also name a time in which that has, you've been really impressed by that, and a time that, you know, you feel maybe it was a waste of time to talk to someone kind of out of the blue?
Just seems natural to take people seriously. Take that book by Jonathan Rose that you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's the kind of people you should be delighted to have a chance to talk to. Okay, they're all around us.
Spectacular.
Much better than the Harvard Faculty Club.
For sure. All right. Well, on that note, I thank you so much for your time. It really means a lot to us, and hope to see you again, and hope you keep safe.
Good to talk to you again.
Cheers. Thank you.